Great to have two COMP-CANs in 1 week. But I'd first like to start by acknowledging that we're eating and learning and gathering on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam Nations here at UBC Point Grey. Also like to thank Yves Tibargen, who's not here today, and Catherine for their work in organizing, and everyone on the Zoom. We look forward to your questions and comments after the presentation. On to the main event. Looking forward to hearing from you, Professor. The last time you talked about filibustering to me was in the American context, so this will be a little different here today. I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation on legislative brawling and obstruction, your rigorous research on this topic, and then having a discussion after. So thank you for your generosity in sharing with us, and also your great attendance at COMP-CAN throughout the year. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, let's get started. Okay, let's start with the defining what the legislative brawling means, because this is actually something new here. In this paper, I define legislative brawling as using the physical force to block unwanted legislation. So, for example, in 2011, when the National Assembly of Korea was debating the ratification of the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, an opposition member simply threw the tear gas into the chamber. So this is one example where you can use physical force to block unwanted legislation. And legislative brawling actually is not confined to this Korea, actually. This is actually more common. So according to a recent study, between 1990 and 2018, there were 368 cases of legislative brawling across the world. Okay? So brawling is actually more common than you might think. So the question is then, why these people, I mean, these are the people who are elected by their own people, why do they fight? Can they simply go no to unwanted legislation and accept outcome? Okay. I mean, and this is an important question because in democracy, one thing that we value is that it's the peaceful resolution of the policy differences. If you are not able to do it in a peaceful way, then there is a military coup and other things, okay? So this is an important question, and because of that, there are other studies that try to answer this question. Okay. But my view is that none of these studies actually explain why members of the legislative body actually engage in physical violence. Okay. So earlier studies, I call them descriptive and interpretive studies. I mean, they argue that this type of brawling represent the public performance. And that's a good idea, but the problem is they don't provide micro-foundation. I mean, they don't explain who are more likely to engage in such behavior and when it is likely to happen. So to be useful as a theory, at least you should be able to explain when it is likely to happen, by whom. Okay? In that sense, more recent studies that focus on cross-country comparison actually is quite useful because they focus on institutional factors to explain when it is likely to happen. Okay? So according to them, so legislatures in new democracy or fragmented legislatures, they are more likely to explain legislative brawling. Okay. So at least they can explain where it is likely to happen. But again, there's some gap. I mean, they cannot explain why some individual legislators are more likely to engage that type of behavior than others within the same legislation. Okay. So there are some studies that look at the individual incentives. Okay. There are not many, but main focus for them is to use the personal background of legislators to explain why they engage in that type of behavior. And according to a study on the parliament in Ukraine, legislators who had a previous job in the security forces or police forces, they were more likely to engage in this type of behavior. So they tend to hint that it's the violent nature of this legislature that makes them to be engaged in this violence in the floor of the parliament. In this paper, I present an alternative theory based on the individual incentives. Okay? This is the signaling theory of legislative brawling. Okay? This is quite similar to the earlier studies that says that the brawling is more like a public performance. But the big difference is that I look at the individual incentive, micro-foundation of this behavior. Okay? The goal here is to actually to explain who are likely to engage in this type of behavior and when. Okay? And to do that, I actually rely on the classic signaling game theory. Okay? So before I proceed, let me just summarize what this classic signaling game theory is first. Okay? So the classic game theory, classic signaling theory formulated by Michael Spence actually was applied to the labor market. And in this setup, there were three players. There was an employer who wants to hire someone who has a high skill. But the problem is the employer cannot observe individual job candidates' level of skills. And there are two types of skill, job candidates, who has high skill and who has low skill. And he explains that in this situation, individual candidates' level of education actually can serve as credible signal of their level of productivity. And for that to happen, there are some conditions. First, the education has to be costly, which makes sense because to earn a degree, it's costly financially and you have to do a lot of work, right? So it is costly behavior. And another key condition here is that the cost of education should vary across candidates. Okay? And here we can assume that the cost of education will be higher for the candidate who has low productivity level. Which makes sense because you have a low productivity level, it takes longer to produce an essay and things like that. Okay, so if these are the conditions that you meet, then you can actually use this level of education as a signal of the level of productivity. Okay, and employee have a strong incentive to do that. And because of that, the job candidate who has a high skill level, they have a stronger incentive to invest in education. This is despite the fact that education itself does not increase your skill level. We know that this is actually the truth, but they do it because it's useful as a signal, because that's what the employers are looking for. Okay? So this is how they use the signaling game in labor market. Now let's apply this to politics, legislative politics. And to do that, instead of an employer, let's assume that there are voters, or partisan supporters, or sometimes it can be party leaders or faction leaders, who can actually hire legislators to deliver certain policies. Okay? And instead of job candidates, we can apply the legislators. And we can assume that legislators have different types of the policy commitment. Some of them are strongly committed to delivering certain policies, some of them are less. And we can simply call them extreme legislators and moderate legislators. Okay. And if you have that, then I argue that we can actually they can use the obstructions, for example, the talking filibuster or legislative brawling actually as a signal of their commitment with a certain policy. Why that is likely to happen? First, obstructions like a filibustering is costly. I mean, we are talking about the talking filibuster. You have to stand up in the podium and you have to talk constantly. And that's physically taxing. And also there's opportunity cost. I mean, if you engage that type of behavior, you lose opportunity to engage in other events like the campaign events or other legislative events. And brawling is also costly because you can be harmed physically. And also there's the cost of reputation because media will portray you in a negative way. And even further, there's a possibility of punishment. You can be censured, or sometimes you can be expelled from the parliament. Okay, so certainly this behavior, they are costly. And also, I will argue that the cost of this behavior will be different, depending on the type of legislatures. And I will argue that these behaviors will be higher for moderate legislatures. And there are two reasons. First, this type of intense behavior, they are usually not consistent with the moderate stand of the moderate legislators. And another reason actually is different from the labor market. When you are thinking about the politics, in labor market, we cannot simply assume that every employer wants the same thing. But in politics, voters want different things. We can think of the extreme voters, they want certain policy really strongly. And moderate voters, they are less strongly committed to a certain policy. And the problem for moderate legislature is that we can assume that moderate legislatures, they are likely to seek support from moderate voters, and extreme legislatures, they are more likely to seek support from extreme voters. And the extreme voters, they are less likely to approve this type of intense behavior. And there are studies that actually shows that. Okay? So given that, we can assume that these extreme legislators, they are more likely to engage in the obstruction or brawling compared to the moderate legislators. But the hypothesis that the extreme legislatures are more likely to engage in brawling actually can be generated by another theory. This is the theory that we talked about earlier, the violent nature theory. Okay? So here, the argument can be something like this. Some legislatures are violent in nature, and they are more likely to be extreme, and they are more likely to use violence because of their nature. Okay? So then, I mean, there are studies that actually shows that, the earlier example of Ukraine, and also we can go back to the Germany, and not just in Germany, before they became the dictatorship, they used the violence on the floor of parliament quite frequently. So there's some reason to believe that the violent nature actually can drive some legislatures to engage in this violent behavior. Okay? And then the problem is we have the same hypothesis produced by two different theories. So how should we test these two theories? For that, I go back to the theory. And then if you go back to the signaling theory, the thing that matters is the costly signal. And brawling is one of those costly signals. But there are also other tools like obstructions. They can serve the purpose of the costly signal. Because obstructions, like a talking filibuster, it's costly. Okay? So they can use this obstruction to send the signal. But these obstructions, like talking filibuster, is less costly than brawling. Because if you engage in brawling, the costs include physical harms, and also the possibility of punishment, like a sanction. At least if you engage in obstruction, there's no such cost. But still, it is costly because you have to stand up and then you have to talk constantly. Okay? So hypothesis we can produce from this signaling theory is that when you have a tool for obstruction, then these extreme legislatures, they are more likely to go for the obstruction rather than brawling. Because you have other tools, they can serve the same purpose, and they are less costly. But the key thing is it has to be costly to serve as a signal. Okay? And certainly the talking filibusters serve that purpose. Okay? So according to the signaling theory, now we have a hypothesis. If they don't have a tool for obstruction, certainly extreme legislatures will engage in brawling. But if they have a tool for obstruction, they are more likely to use that tool. On the other hand, the violent nature theory argues that no matter what you have a tool for obstruction, it doesn't matter because obstruction is non-violent tool. So violent legislatures, they are less likely interested in that tool. So whether you have a tool for obstruction or not, these legislatures will go for violence anyway. Now we can actually test which theory actually is correct. But for that, we need a case that allows us to compare the behavior of legislatures when there was a tool for obstruction and when there was no tool for obstruction. Okay? And for that, the National Assembly of Korea before and after 2012 actually is perfect case. Okay? Because before 2012, basically the minority in the legislature did not have any tool for obstruction. Because the majority has a tool called the speaker's discharge power. That means the speaker has the power to dislodge a bill from a committee and then just force a vote. Okay? So according to a study, when the speaker used this power, 90% of the time they allowed only 1 day to debate the bill. Only 1 day. That means minority, they didn't have any tools for obstruction. Okay? The only option available for them was just fight. But that changed in 2012 because they changed the rules of the game in 2012. First, they limited the use of the speaker's discharge power to national emergencies. And instead, they introduced the filibuster procedure. Okay? And this filibuster procedure actually is a good candidate for costly signal because according to the rule, to engage in filibuster, you have to stand up. And you are not allowed to talk about non-germane issues. You only have to talk about the issue related to the bill. Okay? So it is costly, but it is not effective tool to block legislation, just like the education is not effective in increasing your skill level. Why? Because according to the rule, the bill on the filibuster can be voted in the next legislative session. The problem in the South Korean legislature is that the legislative session is not continuous. So that means majority can say that, oh, we will hold the legislative session in a short time period, only 10 days. And we will debate a controversial bill that can be filibustered. And then after the session ends, then the bill will be voted automatically in the next legislative session. So this is not an effective tool to block unwanted legislation, but it is costly anyway. In other words, this is a perfect candidate for the costly signal. Yeah. So given this setup, the prediction according to the signaling theory is that before 2012, extreme legislators, they are more likely to engage in brawling because they didn't have a tool for obstruction. But after 2012, they should be engaging in filibuster. But according to the violent nature theory, it doesn't matter. The extreme legislature should be engaging in violence before and after 2012. So now, to test this theory, first we need to measure the brawling and who participated in brawling. But this is actually tricky because typically what happens is that a group of legislators will block the entrance to the chamber or to the access to the podium. But the problem is some members are really active and willing in their role, but others are really passive. And there's no official record to record who participated in brawling and who did not. Yeah? So we need to actually have a strategy to target those active members who engage in those behavior. So my approach here is to use the censure resolutions. Okay? So in the legislatures, members can be censured for many reasons. They can be censured for using unparliamentary language or insult upon other members, or they can be censured for corrupt act, or they can be censured for assault on other members. So my strategy is I just look at the censure resolutions, and those I find out those who actually were censured or became the target of censure for their violent actions or for their vandalism. Okay. Then we can actually identify who actually participated in the brawling more actively than others. I mean, I think this is an advantage of using the censure resolution. Okay. But there's one problem. Just like any other bills, these censure resolutions can be proposed by politicians themselves. So there's a possibility that they can use this for political purposes. For example, they will use this to publicly shame these opposition members. So we need to check these censure resolutions actually reflect the actual behavior of members, rather than this is some kind of strategic move by the opposition members. So what I do is actually I check that by comparing the target of censure for brawling versus target of censures for other reasons. So if this censure resolution reflect the actual behavior that we are trying to measure, then for censure resolution for brawling should be targeting more extreme members, because that's the theory. On the other hand, censure resolution for other actions should not be targeting the extreme legislators. Then we can be confident that the censure resolution actually is based on their actual behavior. Does it make sense? So that's what I'm going to do. Okay. So by the way, this is actually the total number of censure resolutions from 2004 to up to 2020. Okay. And the black dot represent the total number of censure for brawling, and blue dot represent the censure for other reasons. So what we see here is that before 2012, the procedural reforms, these two categories, they actually had the same trend. They were increasing. But after 2012, the procedural reforms, still the censure for other actions, they keep increasing. But censure for brawling actually dropped to zero. We already have an evidence against the violent nature theory. Because after the reform, there was no more brawling incident. But anyway, so now we need to find the evidence to support the signaling theory. And for that, we need to measure the ideology of members, because the theory says that the extreme members are more likely to engage in brawling before 2005. So I just use the ideal point estimation technique, which is commonly used in the US Congress and the European Parliament. So I take all legislative votes and then I estimate the ideology. And here, the large number represent more conservative ideology, and small number represent more liberal ideology. But I checked the famous members, and then I checked whether they make sense or not. They make sense. Okay. So first, to give you a sense, this is the distribution of the minority members' ideology. And in 17th Assembly, between 2004 and 2008, Conservative Party was minority party. So this is the distribution of the Conservative Party members. And these names, they are in Korean, obviously. And this location represents their ideal point. So what it says is that more conservative members of the Conservative Party, they are more likely to engage in brawling. I mean, there are some exceptions like this guy. I mean, he's moderate, but he engaged in brawling anyway. But in general, more conservative members of the Conservative Party, they were likely to fight. And in the 18th Assembly, now the same figure, but now the Liberal Party is minority party. So what we see is that when Liberal Party is minority party, more liberal members, they are the ones who fight. Like this guy. And this is the guy who actually used the tear gas. Okay. So again, this is consistent with the prediction of the signal decay. But I mean, before we do that, we need to actually make sure that this is actually still robust, even after we taking into account some confounding factors. So I just looked at some of the relevant factors like the seniority and I mean, this is the Korea is mixed member system. Some members are elected from district. Some members, they are elected from proportional representation system from the national district. And some characteristics from their district. Anyway, so the 17th Assembly, when the Conservative Party was minority, the ideology here is positive. That means more conservative members of Conservative Party, they are more likely to engage in brawling. I mean, this is not significant, but if you take out this guy, this is actually this becomes significant. And that guy is the influential observation. So this is consistent with the theory. And in 18th Assembly, when the Liberal Party was minority, this negative coefficient for the ideology means that more liberal members, they are more likely to engage in brawling. Again, consistent with the theory. And by the way, here I present the result for the censure for other regions and censure for brawling. As I said earlier, we need to make sure that actually censor resolutions, they reflect the actual behavior we are trying. For censure for brawling, they are almost always targeting the extreme members. For censure for others, they don't. So now we can be more confident that the censure resolutions, they are really reflecting the actual behavior of members. Okay. So that's the before the procedural reforms. After procedural reforms, we expect that more extreme members, they are more likely to engage in the tools of obstruction, the filibuster. Okay? And here I measure the engagement in filibuster using the total minute they spoke during the filibuster. And the reason for that is, I mean, speaking just 5 minutes is hardly any costly thing compared to speaking like 10 hours. So to capture that difference, I used the total minute they spoke during filibuster. Okay. In 19th Assembly, 38 members, they spoke a total of 192 hours. And in 20th Assembly, 28 members spoke a total of 76 hours. Now, I'm going to present the same picture. This is the 19th Assembly, when the Liberal Party was minority. And here I introduce this height of the bar to show the length of their speech. So I rescale them to fit it into this picture. Okay? But the longer bar represents they spoke longer. So what we see here is that when Liberal Party was minority party, more liberal members, they are more likely to speak longer. I mean, some moderate they spoke, but they are not using it as a credible signal because it's hardly costly anyway. So this is again consistent with the prediction of the signaling theory. And this is the 20th assembly when Conservative Party was minority. So what we see is again, more conservative members of the Conservative Party, they are the ones who talk longer. Okay? Again, why? To send out the signal. And again, I check the confounding factors and then see if still this relationship holds. Yes, it does. So again, when Liberal Party was minority, more liberal members, they are more likely to talk longer. When Conservative Party was minority, more conservative members, they are more likely to talk longer. So to summarize, we find evidence that support the signaling game theory, the signaling theory here, because extreme members, they were more likely to engage in brawling when they did not have the tools for obstruction. But after the tool became available, they are the ones who actually spoke longer. Up to this point, we focus on the extreme legislators, but there's actually one other piece of the evidence we can utilize. That's what about the moderate legislators? Well, in general, according to the theory, moderate legislators, they are not excited about certain policies. That's why we do call them moderate. But there can be a certain policies that actually the moderate voters actually care about. Then moderate legislators actually have to do something about that. And I say there's one issue like that, and that is the brawling itself. And actually it's the case because in 2008 election, the Conservative Party, actually they captured the presidency and the legislature after 10 years of the Liberal Party's control over the presidency. So the Conservative Party, actually, they were really keen on passing some of the conservative agendas. And the minority liberals, they were keen on blocking everything. So what happened is that they had multiple physical fights. And it was quite intense because that's the time when they used tear gas, hammers, and chainsaws. And another way to actually see how salient this issue was, just look at the media coverage of the brawling. And this picture shows the total number of the news report that reported the brawling. And you can see from 2008, 2012, this is really a lot of big issues. Okay? So the moderate voters, they do not approve all those behaviors. And now the moderate legislators, they feel like, oh, we need to do something about it. Okay? So they did it actually. So in 2010, when the conservative majority had, they actually pushed through the budget bill. And again, there was another fight. And the public opinion was so bad. So some of the moderate members, they feel threatened. What they did was they actually made a promise, public promise, that they are not going to engage in brawling anymore. And even further, they promised that we are not going to seek re-election if we break that pledge. It wasn't just a cheap talk because they also formed a caucus, a group among themselves, to reform the procedures of the assembly. And in their caucus, they produced proposals that included limiting the speaker's discharge power to national emergencies and introducing the filibuster procedure. And eventually they passed. But anyway, so if the signaling theory is correct, then we expect who to join this caucus? Moderates, because this is the moderate voters issue. So moderate legislature, they have to take some costly action, which is this. Form a caucus and they show the moderate voters that we are doing everything to change the procedures in the legislature. Okay? So I checked, and here, and this is when among the conservative majority, this negative coefficient means that more moderate members, they are more likely to join this caucus and try to reform the procedures in the legislature. Okay? Again, this is consistent with the theory of the signaling. So to summarize, we looked at the extreme legislatures and we checked whether their behavior changes depending on the availability of the obstruction tool. And they are consistent with the theory. And even moderate legislatures actually behave according to the signaling theory when there was the issue when moderate voters really cared about. Usually there's not much issue, but in this case there was one, And as we expected, moderate legislatures actually they took costly actions. So what are the lessons? Commonly, when you think about they fight in the legislature, they are barbarians or they are violent. It actually is not necessarily true. And some studies argue that they are not institutionalized. Maybe, maybe not. I will say this is more about the lack of institutionalization. It's more about the lack of proper institution, proper procedure that allows some members to actually express their commitment to certain policy. So in that sense, the filibuster procedure, the talking filibuster, it's costly and it's not effective in blocking unwanted legislation, but still, it's quite effective in getting rid of this brawling and violence in the legislature. In a sense, recently in the US Congress, in the Senate, usually they have silent filibuster. But sometimes we see some members of the Senate actually they talk. Like Ted Cruz against the Obama's abortion, the immigration policy, and Rand Paul against the surveillance of the US citizen. And Chris Murphy, he's from Connecticut. Connecticut is the state that experienced the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting. And they engaged in this talking filibuster. Why? To demonstrate their commitment to certain policies. So this is actually more common, okay? So the point I want to make is that Korea is only one case. This is one case study. But there are a lot actually we learned from this case. Okay? And especially Korea has really strong reputation of being violent for a while. But then suddenly this violence is gone away. So experience of this legislation actually can be useful for other legislations who experience the same problem. Okay? I would say this actually can be applied to the even US Senate. They are discussing about how to change the filibuster procedure right now. Currently they use filibuster to block legislation. But introducing the talking filibuster that require members of the Senate to stand up in the podium. If you want to block legislation, you have to stand up and then you have to talk constantly. That actually can be useful to reform. So, yeah, this is a case study, but I'll say there's more implications. All right, that's it.
Great, well, I'll get us started with a question or two, and then it'd be great to open it up and also to the folks on Zoom. So Professor, I have a content question followed by a theoretical question. So my first question is, are there any documented examples in the 17th or 18th Assembly of women who participate in brawling?
Yeah, there are women, yeah.
There are women,
yeah.
Okay. Because I was
not a lot, but there were some women actually legislature who engaged in the brawling, yes.
Yeah, so the reason that I ask about it is because, well, we're trying to explain the motivations for communicating policy support. So I see that there's about 1 in 5 women legislators in South Korea who are women. And so I'm thinking about, because we looked at what was it, the different variables, seniority, and we looked at ideology to explain these behaviors. But how might women legislators signal their policy commitment in different ways than men pre-2012 or even post-2012? So that's one thing I was thinking about. Because if there were less women who participated in brawling or filibustering, does the signaling theory therefore assume that women are moderates? Or could women have more extreme positions and yet communicate that policy in a different way? That's what I was thinking about.
I didn't include gender to control for their behavior on brawling and filibuster. But I know there are cases where the female legislature, they engaged in brawling. Mm-hmm. And also female legislature, actually one of the female legislators, she almost had a record of the, yes, and then she actually was about to set the record of the filibuster. Where was that? This is actually, she was able to set the record. Like she spoke like 10 hours or something. And then later on this guy came and then I will break the record anyway. But there are actually some female members who actually engaged in obstruction. And also the brawling. But given earlier, before 2012, there were not many female members in the legislature. But still, there are a couple of the legislators who engaged in the brawling. So not sure how gender will actually have an influence here. And usually when female members engage in brawling, the opposition party will send the female members to deal with that. Okay? That's one dynamic I saw. I mean, it could be relevant, but I say in general, I don't think gender has a huge impact in this dynamic.
The reason I ask is because if we were to, I mean, you showed us how you considered who was a more extreme member and who was a more moderate member based on how we voted. So if we take all the extreme women legislators and all the extreme men legislators, and then look at who's engaging in filibustering and who's engaging in brawling, if men are more likely to communicate their positions in that way than women, I'd be curious why. Yeah,
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I need to see, but I mean, at this point, for brawling, I don't think I have enough data to do that because before 2012, there are not many female members in the legislature. So, not sure about that. But I mean, that's a good question.
Yeah, something to consider. Yeah. But thank you very much. I have more questions, but I'd love to hear from other voices. Great.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, did I correctly take away from a graph that post-2012, no more brawls happened?
No more brawls, yes.
No more, okay. So I find all of this very persuasive. It's amazing that you cleverly kind of exploited the pre and post reform period to do this analysis, and I think it makes perfect sense. The data supports the effectiveness of this institutional reform. Just to rule out other possible explanations for it, is there any reason to believe that just, for other political reasons that post-2012, like the nature of the things debated shifted such that brawls were less likely to occur anyway?
That's a good question.
Grew tired of the kind of, I presume, the polarization in that previous period? Or alternatively, did new mechanisms to send signals emerge in 2012 or around that period that don't have that kind of costliness of getting your face in? Yeah. Like, I'm thinking Twitter or social media. And think about American legislators, like someone like Ted Cruz, he gets on social media and sends signals to his constituencies. And that's a function of this period where these social media tools come up that is independent of the reform. So I'm not questioning the results, because it makes perfect sense. But if it's like compounded,
right?
If other things are also assisting this,
right?
And if I could just building on that, I wondered about you had a chart there that showed that the media coverage after around 2010, 2012 or whatever was intensely high. Did that change the cost of engaging in brawling in the sense of less likely to be reelected, or some other behavior that changed the calculus? Since you're focusing on individual incentives, I wondered if, for lack of a better term, greater salience of the issue among the public resulted in a higher cost of engaging in that behavior.
That's good. I mean, certainly that's possible. I mean, certainly the new norm might have developed which make the engaging in brawling more costly. Certainly that is possible, okay? And also there could be other changes. But I mean, there are also the opposite changes that actually increase the likelihood of the brawling, like party polarization. There's actually studies that shows that political parties are more polarized over time. Okay? So one thing that I will try to do in this was, this is after the 2012 reform, I actually look at the censure for other regions and see if there's any changes in the dynamic. The reason for that is, here there's no more censure for brawling, but what if parties are polarized and everything can be explained by ideology? I checked, and that is not the case, actually. See, the dynamics for censure for other regions, they remain relatively same. So I was trying to actually see if there are other things that they change. And I still kind of use this censure for other regions as a kind of control group. And then you can see.
Are you able to share your screen again? I think I canned it for
I don't care. And this is actually quite important. If this procedural changes really had the causal effect, how do you explain this? This is the kind of control group and treatment group. You can think of it that way. This is not same as the lab experiment, but at least they had parallel trend, and then this trend actually suddenly dropped. Only this one. This one is directly affected by the procedural reform, and this is not. So in a way, we can see this is actually, there's some degree of causal effect of this reform. And I did that in this way, and then I look at the dynamic, whether there is a dynamic changes in the control group of this one. And we don't see that evidence. Yeah. But it's possible because there might be something else that I couldn't capture here.
Just coming back to sort of that alternative explanation, did the people that brawled continue to get elected in subsequent?
Some of them, yeah, some of them actually. There was one guy actually. This is the guy. I mean, this is during a filibuster, and this is the guy who was target of the censure for brawling 3 times. And in 2016, he stood up to engage in filibuster. And this is what he said, actually. He said, I was publicly ashamed and blah, 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 but if there was no filibuster, then already I have fight already. That's what he said. So what I actually showed you today actually is this statement actually is authentic. It's not just saying, oh, actually his behavior is backed up by my data analysis. Now they have a tool to demonstrate their commitment, and they are using it. Yes?
I don't know if this is, because I mean, obviously, the cost is sort of the signal here, but is there anything that could signal the type of policy that is occurring, and then therefore that would provide a different type of signal? Like if there's more brawling depending on the policy, I don't know if that makes sense. Because obviously it goes down to 0 brawling, so then it's not the policy, it's the cost. But I wonder if like the pre-trend has something else that shows that.
I mean, is it connected to what Kelly was saying earlier? Like there are other ways they can actually send out the signal, right?
Well, no, it's actually, because I was thinking as you were like explaining, if it's the type of policy that is causing them to brawl or filibuster, or it's just this cost and it has nothing to do with the policy.
I mean, it should be some policy. Like I said, they don't fight on every issue.
Yeah.
They fight on the more ideological partisan issues. Actually. I mean, I think that's what justifies using my measure of ideology, because I take every vote and then I kind of measure the general ideology. Okay, but this could be a problem. But in general, they are more likely to fight each other when this issue is partisan or ideological, rather than this issue is like a more distributive or parochial issues. So,
but put another way, was this 2008, this like really intense period of brawling, was that because like really big issues that polarized people were, that was just like a period of time in Korea that was being debated? And post 2012, it's been a bit more like caretaker, governments that like kind of just tinker with the markets and therefore.
So yeah, right. Again, this is another possibility that what happened before and after 2012. Maybe before 2012, there were more like partisan or ideological issues, but after 2012, you don't see that many issues. But I would say a lot of issues they engaged in filibuster, they are more like that actually. I mean, I don't have the same issue they debated before and after. That could be really nice. But some issues actually are really partisan, like sending troops to Iraq. I mean, the filibuster, the first filibuster happened on that issue because US requested sending some troops to the Iraq, and then liberals say, well, not happy with it. So they debated it. And this is actually quite big debate. So I would say it's possible that the agenda has changed before and after 2012, and they might explain the change in their behavior, but hardly. And especially because of the trend of partisan polarization increasing over the years, I think that's less likely to be the case. But that's a good point, actually. I need to highlight, there are a lot of studies about party polarization, and there's evidence despite that they are fighting, okay? Right. Party polarization is actually helping me.
Yeah.
So your paper also dealt with normative features of democracies to some extent by showing this transition from brawling, which obviously is violent, to filibustering, which is a more peaceful form of protest. And you said in your paper that brawling, quote, raises the possibility for censure or expulsion, end quote. So the possibility word was interesting to me because this means that are there cases where brawling occurs and there is no censor? But more than that, I'm thinking about institutional consequences for brawling. So we've talked about the cost in the public opinion, the cost in the media, but for legislators who have moved, or legislatures around the world who have moved past this issue of brawling, are there stronger institutional consequences for brawling than a possibility that you may or may not be expulsed? Like how, so I'm thinking more of features of democracy now more broadly.
That's a good question. I think, first of all, I don't think any member actually was censured for brawling. There was the censure resolution proposed, but none of them passed. It's kind of it's a response to the public opinion in general. You know, I mean, when there's a brawling incident, usually media is really negative about that, and then public asks the member, you need to do something about this, you need to maintain the order. Then as a token, they say that, oh, we will censor this legislation, but they usually don't pass. Okay? So actually, this is one reason why using censure resolution actually is quite good measure, because there's less political calculation. It's more like a response to the public opinion. They're trying to show that they are doing something about this chaos in the legislature. But let's stop at that. So to go back to your question, I'm not sure about that. I mean, it's more about the difference across countries, right? Some institutions are more sticky than others. So in other way, I mean, there are studies that shows that the new democracies more likely experience the legislative brawling. I mean, that makes sense, okay? I'm not denying that this is totally the lack of institutionalization cannot explain everything, but there are certain degrees to that. But again, really it's about the institution or procedures they have. If they allow some kind of the demonstration of commitment, that will help a lot. So, am I answering your question or going to the other question? Yeah, so, yeah. Really, I mean, the issue is do they have proper procedures that allow some opposition members or some members who really have a salient issue, they can demonstrate their commitment or not. If not, I mean, usually they can go to the military and ask for coup or something. So letting the minority actually express their opinion actually is, in some degree, is really important in a sense, I would say.
Do you have any other promising jurisdictions out there that to replicate this on? So I don't have any, shamefully focused on Canada.
I was wondering about Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like where there have not been reform efforts. And
I don't know. I mean, I cited a lot about these studies on Taiwan. Actually, there's a study that shows that the strong partisan voters, they actually support brawling. If extreme minority voters, because that's what they want. Right? But in general, general public and the moderate public, they don't approve that. Okay? But I don't know if there was any rule changes to address that issue. I'm not sure. I don't think there was any changes, because the paper that I cite actually is published in 2020. And I don't know.
I think you said your data, what you had identified 360, or somebody else had identified
Right, somebody else
360 cases. And how many countries are represented by that 360? And can you look at the institutional features, the democratic structures of those countries to see if that explains anything? I was thinking maybe veto points or something, starting something very easy that allow obstruction, that's not legislation per se, but obstruction, and just sort of see if there's any kind of, at a superficial level, any kind of relationship there.
I don't know. I mean, the data of the cross-country at the level of legislature is quite rare, I would say. I mean, there's some the data that actually look at how strong these the legislatures are compared to the executive branch. But I don't think there are any study that actually shows do they have like procedures like a filibuster or not. I'm not sure. I haven't found any data set like that.
Are there any studies on this topic that use a mixed methods approach, like perhaps with in-depth interviews? As I look at your quote on the screen right now, so the legislator explains his motivation, and of course there's all sorts of issues about bias or us identifying our own motivations for something, but I wonder if there could be more depth to it, that in-depth interviews, I mean, in a perfect world could expose, especially thinking about the women legislatures, but just in general, I'm curious how people would explain their behavior, or is that a limited methodology? Like how would you address that?
I mean, first of all, interview, I'm not sure whether we can trust what they say. I mean, they are politicians. I mean, they will say, I'm really committed to this policy. I mean, they will say, they are always committed to the policy. The voters care about it. But I mean, really? So I'm not sure how much you can actually drive out of that. But I mean, still, what can we do?
I thought of it seeing the block quote on the screen, and I mean, it seems sincere. How do we know, of course?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that he said during the filibuster.
Yeah.
I mean, usually we say, but after I do data analysis, I can say that his statement is true. But based on his statement, I'm not sure. So you have to have some kind of the other support or evidence. But just take their words. We know they are not.
But I guess that goes back to the point on re-election, right?
Mhm.
Yes. Because then if, he signals violence here, for example, what are the odds of him being re-elected if he just filibustered?
I mean, the thing is, I mean, they want to be re-elected.
Yeah.
Right? And some members, they are targeting the extreme, like voters to get their support. I mean, in Korea, the nomination system is really complicated. It's kind of the mixture of the public opinion and party activists and the party leaders. I mean, there's factions within parties. So all those things matters. So here I simply assume that the extreme legislatures, they are looking for support from the extreme voters or extreme party activists or extreme faction leaders. And moderate voters, they are more likely to seek support from moderate voters and moderate party activists and things like that. And some of them are actually re-elected multiple times. And another thing is, in Korea, I mean, the re-election rate is not that high. Okay? And so it's not easy to do kind of the post-after, what is the difference in difference. We can do that because there are not many members who actually serve a long time. Okay? So that's kind of the limit, I would say, in terms of designing this type of study. But if it is US, certainly I can actually look at how that type of behavior actually affect their re-election chance. Right?
Because I guess, I mean, this is an extreme case, but if you support the politician because they are violent, and suddenly they're not violent anymore, like the opposite of the opposite of it, would that influence your vote on the violent?
I mean, if you have a case, I mean, their district has changed. I mean, they were actually really kind of extreme district in 1 year, and then in next year, they are actually representing in more moderate district, and we expect them to change their behavior, right? Something like that. But I don't think that's common. Usually the extreme members, they target the extreme district. And moderate legislature, they target the moderate district, or the other way around. I mean, it's driven by the district interest. They actually stick to certain policy stance, and then they try to remain that way. Because changing their position usually is not good politics. Right? I don't know.
Yeah, just extending on your question, Catherine. So we talked about the media reports that condemn brawling in general terms, obviously. It's violent, X, Y, and Z. Is there any sort of public opinion data about some of the louder members or the ones who are most involved in brawling, looking at how their reputations changed in the public view 2016, 2018? Is there any of those, like do we have any data on that?
No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I try to look at some of the public opinion data.
No, it just came to mind because as you were mentioning earlier, some fringe voters do look for those strong kind of acts, and so I was curious to see if the public was happier with this change or
Right. I mean, ideally, if you can actually show the public opinion data that shows that the extreme voters, they are more likely to support that type of behavior, and moderates, if they don't, then I have like a signals. I mean, I just look at the who sent the signal. Obviously, I mean, the ideal design is to actually see the who received the signal in a correct way. Then it will be really perfect. But unfortunately, I don't have the data from the receiver side. But the earlier study, actually, they look at the public opinion from Taiwan, and I took a lot of hints from that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you come across any other legislators that do not allow filibustering, but do not engage in legislative violence.
You mean the allow filibuster?
They don't
Don't
allow
allow.
filibuster.
They don't allow filibuster, but they don't fight. Oh, okay. I mean, I can think of the U.S. Senate House. They don't have a filibuster, but still we don't see brawling quite a lot. And how do you explain it? I mean, I would say that this is something that they go back to your question. I mean, there are other things they can do to send out their signal in a credible way. I mean, I don't think the Facebook or Twitter is really costly signal. It's typing something and then send it out. It's hardly costly. To serve as a costly signal, they should be able to demonstrate this is really difficult. I mean, that's why recently some members of the Senate actually they stand up and then they talk. Instead, they could send out the Twitter or like that. But the value as a credible signal is low. Right? But in the House, I would say they can do other things like attaching amendment to a bill or something else. They can actually serve some purpose of the as a credible signal. And in Korean legislature, the problem is, I mean, the individual members, they have a limited opportunity to propose amendments. As I said earlier, when they had this speaker's discharge power, they allowed only one day to debate the bill, really squeezing out any possibility of sending signal other than brawling. So that's kind of extreme. But if you allow more debate and some opportunity like propose some amendment that can serve as some kind of a credible signal, then the pressure to engage in fight will be less.
Doesn't have to.
Right.
Filibustering.
Right. So it's the availability of those mechanisms that allow them to send out the signal. You know, in that sense, Korean case is actually really extreme case because before 2012, minorities didn't have any tools other than this fist fight. So it's kind of the pure lab experiment in that sense. I don't know the reviewers will buy that argument, but.
I'm not currently seeing any, but if anyone from the Zoom would like to raise their hand or ask a question, please do so. Yeah, currently not seeing any. Any other questions from the room?
I mean, it seems like a no-brainer for a publication. Where are you at in terms of submission?
I don't know. I mean, I just send out the AJPS and then see what they say. But probably they might desk reject because this is Korea.
Right.
Right. I mean, this is not general enough. I mean, but I don't know. I mean, if it doesn't work that out, then I will go to the LSQ, Legislative Studies Quarterly. I mean, I have another study that look at why they were able to change the rules. I mean, I tried that paper. I mean, in other journals, but again, the same problem. It's if you have only one case, then it's Korea. It's not general enough. Maybe I should change the title. The logic of violence in the legislature. Evidence from Korea, something like that. Then they might buy it. Maybe I should change the title. Yeah. I guess, I mean, yeah, my mistake actually, title should change. It looks like, this is the only interest those people who look at the Korean politics, but actually I try to sell it more like a general case.
Yeah.
Any final comments? Well, thank you so much. I was so looking forward to this.
Okay, thank you.